Welcome the Spirit Plant Medicine community here in Vancouver and around the world, and to the Facebook Live audience who may be watching, and anybody out there who's watching today. We have a very special guest. Mr. Chris Bache is joining us. Bache, sorry. With Mr. Stephen Gray. Chris is going to be one of our great presenters at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference coming up here in just about a month and a half. And my name is Marc Caron. Really happy to have Chris with us. And of course, my co-producer and organizer, Stephen Gray, with the conference. I'm going to pass it to Stephen to introduce Chris and his work and what we'll be talking about.
Sure. Thank you, Marc. This is going to be a very brief introduction. There's a bio on the conference website, spiritplantmedicine.com, if anyone wants to read more. I will just say that Chris is a retired university professor at Youngstown, Ohio, who was teaching in religious philosophy, I believe, Chris?
Philosophy and Religious Studies Department.
Yeah. Philosophy and Religious Studies Department. More relevant to what we're doing today, or more specifically relevant anyway, is that he became interested in the work of Stanislav Grof, who did a lot of remarkable pioneering work in LSD therapy. And over a period of 20 years, from 1979 to 1999, undertook a remarkable, what Joseph Campbell would probably truly call a hero's journey of 20 years of 73 high-dose LSD sessions, privately with a sitter, with eye coverings and headphones on, with a carefully curated playlist. And the results of that are truly stunning. He wrote about it in a lot about it in his 2000 book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, and has a forthcoming book called Diamonds from Heaven, in which he actually takes the reader through a sequential journey through those 73 sessions, if I'm correct, Chris. Yeah. So perhaps a good way to start, as I've mentioned to you in some of our email exchanges, I've got about 1,000,005 questions. Because I've delved back into your work again, watched the Transpersonal Conference interview or presentation, an interview with some guy named Ian Campbell or something like that as well, and been reading a bunch of Dark Night, Early Dawn, which actually has transcripts from those journeys in it. But perhaps for the viewers, maybe just you could say a little bit briefly about beyond what I said about hearing about Stan Grof's work, what led you into doing this? Why you?
Well, let me just frame this first date-wise, and that's maybe the most important thing to start with. I came out of graduate school in '78, and I started this 20-year journey in 1979 and finished it in '99. So you have to take your mind back to what was happening in 1978. Stan Grof had just published his first book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. I had come out of graduate school in philosophy of religion. I was an atheistically inclined agnostic. I read Stan's book, and it just clicked. Something deep inside me knew that I had found my life's work. I was convinced that the people working in my field, which was philosophy of religion, who would be making the most important contributions, would be people writing out of an experiential basis, not simply an intellectual basis. So I began this process of systematically undertaking the inner journey to push the limits of consciousness as far as I could, and to see what I could learn using this methodology that Stan had pioneered. I didn't like going outside the law. I would have much rather had done this legally, in a legally sanctioned manner, but this was after the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970. The only option I had to do this work was to go underground, to do it secretively. So I learned the method. I studied all the sources. I devoured Stan's next book, LSD Psychotherapy, always worked with a sitter, worked in a very rigorous manner, and settled down to the work. I worked for 4 years, and then I stopped the work for 6 years, and then I resumed it for a very intense 10 years. So it was actually 14 years of active sessions, averaging about 5 or 6 sessions a year during that time.
Yeah. So where you went with this is, almost impossible to conceive of for most of us. I kind of jokingly said to a couple of friends that it made Terence McKenna's description seem like a pleasant walk on a Sunday afternoon.
God bless Terence.
Minus the aliens, of course.
Yeah.
The self-replicating basketball aliens, yeah. But to be more serious about it, maybe the simplest way to get it going further at this point is to just ask you to say a little bit about. I'm familiar more or less with that, the sort of sequence of that journey, but essentially you just kept going deeper. You used the word, by the way, universe, which seems to be a kind of a synonym for what other people might call, the creator or the creators or the Holy Spirit or whatever. But in any case, this, whatever that is, the universe, which was communicating to you and taking you, very aware of you doing this as an individual and meeting you in the same place you left off the previous time and taking you farther each time. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how that went,
Yeah. Well, first of all, I worked at very high dose levels. I made a conscious choice after the first 3 sessions to work at what I considered to be sort of the maximum intensity dose level. I saw myself as simply doing an extended course of LSD psychotherapy. I mean, there's psycholytic therapy, low dose work, psychedelic therapy, high dose work. And I saw myself doing a series of that. Over time, I realized that I was encountering phenomena and pushing boundaries that were not showing up in classical LSD psychotherapy because that method was limited to 3 sessions maximum. And of course, I was doing many more than that. I don't recommend, really, having done this work, looking back on it, if I were doing it again, I would do it differently. I wouldn't push the system as hard as I pushed the system. There's a price to pay along the way. So I just say that as a preface, as a caveat before we get started. Where I went might just be easiest just to ping through the chapters where I tell this story in Diamonds from Heaven. First 2 years, I went through the perinatal level of consciousness, going through reliving birth and going through many experiences of birth and death, culminating in the complete shattering of my ego, just being turned inside out as I went into the next stage. Then I went through 2 years. Well, let me back up. Sessions always divide between a cleansing portion and an ecstatic portion, a purifying portion, and then the revelatory portion. In the cleansing portion of the next 2 years, I went into an ocean of suffering, just vast. I'm thinking I'm jumping into the details too quickly. Let me back up a little bit.
Sure. Quick interruption before you do.
Yeah.
Do you mind telling us what dosage you were actually taking in micrograms?
I was working at 500 to 600 micrograms.
Okay.
And so my question then is, for our listeners, what would be the, when people are doing LSD in a regular setting, if we can even call it that, what's an average dose of the average,
hard to say.
Maybe
100 micrograms. It's really hard to say. A microdot often is 50, 75 micrograms. A blotter, it really depends, but it could be 100, 150, something like that. Okay. Basically, low dose goes up to 300 micrograms, usually around 200 micrograms. I think many people party at 100 micrograms. I don't know. I mean, I really don't. I don't really have contacts in a partying psychedelic world. It's just not my world.
I understand. I just wanted to maybe kind of get a context for what the average person would, the way they relate to.
Yeah. This is an extremely, very, very intense regimen. I mean, it's very hard on the body. It's very challenging. It really requires kind of an explorer's constitution to weather it well. But I found that this dialogue opened up between me and the universe, or me and the creative intelligence of the universe, or however you want to language it. And I think that the caliber of the conversation and the continuity of conversation that just went systematically layer by layer by layer is not simply a result of the drug state, or it's not simply a result of the consciousness that I was engaging, but I think it is in partly a result of the seriousness and the thoroughness with which I tried to retain complete consciousness at all levels of the conversation, so that I was methodical in recording the conversation, getting it written down within 24 hours after every session. And I spent a lot of time in between sessions thinking about what had happened, trying to internalize what had happened. My experience is that the more seriously and conscientiously we engage these deeper states of consciousness, the more seriously and conscientiously they engage us. Mm-hmm. And then this spiraled. I went through a series of death rebirth processes over these years, taking me somewhat systematically, rather methodically, systematically into deeper and deeper levels of consciousness. As I said, the first 2 years were kind of spent in ego death, or culminating in ego death. Next 2 years took me into a realm that I call the ocean of suffering. It took me deep into the collective psyche of our species. It took me into, well, what I write about in Dark Night or Dawn is a depth of human suffering that I eventually came to understand, or came to believe, that what was happening in these sessions was not aimed at my personal healing or transformation, but it was aimed at the healing of the collective psyche of humanity itself, that somehow in reliving thousands and thousands of years of pain and brutality, there was a healing taking place in those sessions. During the positive side of those sessions, for 1 year, I went into a state that I call deep time, where I experienced the entirety of my life from start to finish, beginning to end, as a simultaneous present. And the second year of the ocean of suffering, which actually 6 years later, I took my break right then. I had 1 year of the ocean of suffering beforehand, 1 year after. I went into this series of experiences, deep initiation into various cosmological processes, initiations into the universe. I was given teaching, an initiation systematically into an understanding of creation, into the processes of creation. From there, after that culminated, and after 2 years, I went into what I came to view as archetypal reality. I spent about 1.5 years exploring different dimensions of archetypal reality, being drawn into vast dimensions of collective consciousness and some of the workings of the collective psyche. I began to have experiences of reincarnation, not as an individual, but as a species, the entire species reincarnating generation by generation, and what that was about and the intelligence there. After those, I went for another year or so deep into what Stan calls causal reality, non-dual consciousness, shunyata, emptiness, began to enter into the primal void. And then that took me about 15 years in, and I still had 5 more years on the journey. And in the last 5 years of the journey, I went into many levels of experience, but basically an encounter with what I call the Diamond Luminosity. My understanding of this is what the Buddhists call Dharmakaya. It is the domain of light that lies outside samsara. It is the crystalline clear light out of which all physical existence emerges. And so I was taken into that reality over 26 sessions. I entered that reality only 4 times. The years in between those 4 entries, which came about once a year, I went through and this was always happening, very, very intense, rigorous purification processes, because states of consciousness, the deeper you go, the purer the state of consciousness. To stabilize consciousness at these higher levels, you have to purify your entire physical, psychological system to be able to maintain coherent consciousness at these levels. If you just glance into them, that's one thing. But if you want to hold awareness for hours at a time stably in these states of consciousness, Your system has to be purified in order to maintain coherent cognition there.
I was just going to ask you about that, actually. It's one of the questions I had written down for myself. I actually took a quote out of Dark Knight that says you have to train yourself in order to maintain coherent cognition in these radical states of consciousness. And then you also used the term you have to learn, or learn how to learn. So I'm always thinking about, the people who are watching this, in case there is any person brave enough and perhaps foolhardy enough to undertake a somewhat similar process. Is there something important you could say to that person or those people about how they need to learn how to maintain that coherent cognition and learn to learn as they would go into a continuing or an ongoing process like this?
I can and I will, but first some preliminaries. One, never work alone. Always be working, and do your homework, do the reading, read the books, understand what you're getting into. Never work alone. Always have an experienced sitter, not a guide necessarily, but a sitter, preferably one. Well, it really has to be someone who knows the ropes, who has entered these states of consciousness, because you're going into territory that is so foreign that people who are not familiar with this territory can easily get frightened and intimidated by what is coming at them. You need someone who can help you stay grounded and help you find the courage to face whatever darkness may arise in those conditions. In terms of, once you take care of safety, once you've curated the playlist, once you have an agreed upon arrangement with your sitter, once you have created all the conditions of containment that allow for these states to be engaged safely, once you have the rules of conduct established, so to speak, then it's a matter of finding within yourself the trust and the capacity to go wherever your consciousness or wherever the session wants you to go, wherever it wants to take you. And it'll take you into excruciating pain and at different times. And one of the things I learned from Stan Grof, and I absorbed from his writing, is a trust in the process, that if you surrender completely and let the process take you wherever it wants to go, it will take you through potentially excruciating dynamics, and it may break you. But in that breaking, in that surrender and dying process, it will also heal you, and it will bring you alive in new ways you had not been alive before. So it's trust, it's courage, it's seeing things through all the way down to the bottom every session. It's really important that every session be taken as far as it can possibly go so that you don't leave unfinished business behind you. Usually when you reach a peak and you go through a death rebirth process, you'll go through the remainder of the session into some positive ecstatic state, and then the system will calm down. The next session you'll resume into wherever you stop the cleansing. If you hold it long enough, eventually this will reach a peak, and then you'll go through into the ecstatic state again. So
one of the things carry on.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things you've spoken about in Dark Knight is that I think the universal primal fear for human beings is the fear of what Buddhists would call non-existence of the individual self, right? So I found it to be quite instructive in Dark Knight that you pointed out that while whatever that illusory self is dies, individuality doesn't. There's a different kind of individuality somehow that arises out of that. I'm always thinking of like the people that are watching this, the kind of people who will come to the conference, what they can learn about this, because I think perhaps some reassurance about that might be helpful, especially for medicine people, right?
Yeah. Well, in the Vedantic tradition, the individual is illusion. So the goal is you destroy the individual, you destroy ego, you die, and then you dissolve into the infinite. And that's not while that's a widespread and deeply held set of convictions, that I don't share that conviction. My experience is that the form of our life can die. Everything that we know ourselves to be and everything we've ever known may die, when may completely be shattered and just completely die. But in that process, you then are reborn. You wake up in a new world, in a new context, and as a new being. And if you go through this process multiple times, you begin to realize that the form of your life is repeatedly dying at deeper and deeper levels, but the essence of your life is indestructible. The ego, Chris Bache, is destructible. You know, that's a temporary form, but the essence underneath that is indestructible. And there is, as the superficial layers of our being perish and fall away, there is a liberation and a freeing of a deeper form of individuality. And I think this is a developmental process that's taking place in reincarnation. Just as we die, and then we're reborn, we die, we're reborn. There is emerging in that process a germinal seed that is individual, but not isolated. Individual, but open to life on all sides.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can, it just begs so many questions, Chris. Maybe I can get about 6 questions into one somehow.
Sure, go for it.
Because it all has to do with a central element of your work, perhaps the central element in terms of other people that you're speaking to, is that on several levels, there's this individual ego death and rebirth process, there's the collective ego death and rebirth process, and in that vein, you've been shown by this creative intelligence, the universe, that several things. One, that we're probably, maybe even certainly, you could correct me on this, approaching an imminent economic and environmental collapse, and secondly, that actually has to happen because of the need for the great death, as you've called it, before the great awakening. And then the one that I want to kind of squeeze into that question as well is, given that I don't think very many people are going to do the kind of deep extended work that you did, for this essential consciousness revolution to actually manifest, I'm wondering if there's things that you can think of, or guidance that you could think of for people that are interested in working with psychedelics, but not at that level. I mean, ways that others can approach this. Yeah.
Sure. I hope not many people would choose to work in the way that I did, or at the level that I did. And I wouldn't do it that way again myself if I were doing it from scratch. I think we are continuously in dialogue with an infinite intelligence. Right now, you and I are existing in our bodies, but our consciousness is in intimate rapport with an infinite consciousness. When we take a psychedelic of any form, and we take a medicine, we hypersensitize our system, and the system begins to go through a spontaneous purification process. And we begin to have to face things that we'd rather not face. We begin to have to look at things that often we'd rather not look at. And we have to remember things that many of us would rather not remember. This is the universe healing us. This is how the universe helps us become whole, helps us heal the fissures which have gotten embedded in our particular system. In that process of healing the body and healing consciousness and healing the soul, healing the former life trauma that we all carry, in that process, we not only remove negativity from the system and heal the system, but we also open the system to new levels of intimacy with the universe itself. So we awaken capacities, we awaken emotional capacities, we awaken intellectual and spiritual capacities within the organism. Everybody has to find their own modulation of this dialogue, of this dance, whether or not, I think this is happening continuously, even if you never take a psychedelic. We're constantly living, we're making choices, we're living in dialogue with the universe. it's a process that's moving very slowly. Reincarnation is a very finely tuned system, but it moves very slowly. When we begin a spiritual practice, whether it's meditation or yoga or trance dancing or psychedelics, we accelerate that process. As we accelerate the process, it not only gets deeper, but it gets larger, so that we enter into deeper rapport with the universe, and we also enter into larger rapport with the universe. So people often begin to be touched by our so-called private work. One of the things I learned in this process is there is no such thing as private spiritual practice. There is no such thing as private healing. Whenever we heal deeply the individual, we always touch the lives of people that we are karmically connected to, whether we ever meet them in the physical body or not. And then if you have a deep heart, if you have a deep felt commitment to other people and to animals and just to the planet, when given the opportunity to do something constructive on behalf of other people, I think most people would say, yes, I'll help. I'll undertake that. Show me what I can do. This is what happened with me in the ocean of suffering. What happened in all the work. When your individual consciousness shatters, you don't spontaneously pop into oneness. I mean, some people do, but you pop into a larger field of consciousness. You move into the consciousness of your species. You move into perhaps the consciousness of Earth. You move into the consciousness of other life forms. When I moved into the consciousness of my species, I experienced my species as a living organism, and I experienced my species on a developmental trajectory. And I experienced over and over again in a way that I was completely unprepared for, caught completely by surprise. I was not at all really well versed in the global systems crisis. But over and over again, I was shown that humanity is coming into a critical hour in its destiny, a critical bifurcation point in its evolutionary process, and that we were poised on the edge of a profound psycho-spiritual awakening, just a profound before and after point in human history, something that would be marked by, well, it would be used as a marker in history for the turning point in humanity. The proportions of this are hard to estimate. And so there was a particular session I called the Great Awakening, which took me deep into this awakening of the entire human species. And I don't know when, I don't know how, it's not like I'm getting details on those, but the certainty of the conviction that humanity is moving in this direction, that we're going there, was very, very strong. And for there, just as in mystical traditions, for a person to achieve spiritual awakening, oneness with God, there must first take place the dark night of the soul, the tremendous purification, the emptying of all the old habits, the emptying of everything that keeps us small in order to allow us to open into that which is large. Likewise for humanity, if humanity is going to go through a profound spiritual awakening, there must take place a dark night of the soul for the entire species, what I call the Great Death. There must be a cleansing of all of the choices that humanity has made, which have kept it fragmented, which have kept it small. The choices against race, the choices against religion, the choices of class, all the ways we've divided and carved up the planet.
Lots of questions about that, but here's one of them. Excuse me. This in terms of this great death and great, rebirth or reawakening of the species. We know that as people lose their ground of their sort of known world becomes unstable. I'm not talking about the seekers now. I'm just talking about the regular folk in a country or whatever. Yeah. Yes, there's a crack that could open up for a potential rebirth, but it seems to me also that is a recipe potentially for a very dystopian scenario, with the sort of, I guess Adolf Hitler would be a classic example where his people got treated like shit after World War I. Marc went nuts. There was all kinds of stability, and Hitler, as a psychopath or whatever, a fascist, took advantage of that. So I'm wondering, like, if we are increasingly, falling into economic and environmental collapse, the instability and fear that could generate, could they not go the opposite way? I mean, what is the universe telling you about that?
It can go the opposite way. We are entering frightening times and hard times. I think the global, I think there's a global systems crisis that is fermenting, which is being driven first by ecological forces and then by a series of historical and economic forces. I think if what I'm seeing is correct, we're entering a time of deconstruction, a time when the normal assumptions of life are going to be stripped from us. We're going to lose control of more and more of our lives. And when that has happened historically, and when it happens in the lives of individuals, it doesn't always produce a beautiful being at the end. It sometimes can produce very ugly results and very destructive, regressive, us against them. At this point, I think we're going to have to choose as a people, individually, and as a people and as a species. As we get into this crisis, we're going to have to make a choice over and over again. We're going to have to make a series of choices. We're going to have to choose on the basis of ego, meaning on the basis of our individual private experience of what serves our individual private good, or what serves a larger collective good, what serves the good of the commons. If we choose inclusive solutions to the crises that are coming, then I think we will make an accelerated pivot into an unbelievable positive future. If we make regressive choices, if we choose a narrow option, if we choose only what's good for us and our kind and us in a narrow sense, I think we'll probably go extinct, because you basically can't run this planet on the basis of the ego and have nuclear weapons and biological weapons, destructive capacity, without there being catastrophic consequences. I think it's the pressure of extinction, which is actually an extraordinarily powerful evolutionary driver, which will be pushing us, I think, to make better choices in the future than we've made in the past. I don't think this is like a magical process where, Spirit's going to take over and the Holy Spirit's going to occur and something's going to happen to save us from ourselves. Mm-hmm. It's not about saving us from ourselves. It's about growing up. It's about taking responsibility for ourselves in history. And one way of thinking about it is, it's about living from our soul, because the soul knows that we are more than this body. The soul knows that we have a web of relationships. The soul knows that the earth that we leave is the earth that we're coming back to. The soul has a depth and a perspective, but we have built a civilization based largely upon the ego's perspective, private self, private me and mine. We are in the process of outgrowing that. I think we're in the process of growing into the experience of the soul on earth. Our soul consciousness, which most people only experience when they're in between lives in the bardo, is actually waking up inside historical existence. But that's not an easy process. That's a birth process. But what my sessions show me, what they tell me, is that we will make it. There's no guarantee. It's an evolutionary process, and there are no guarantees in evolution. But where I have been, what I have seen in my journeys through deep time, is that we do make it. And what's emerging on our planet is an extraordinary being. Just the next generation, or the next form of humanity, what I call the future human, is just... It's just an extraordinary being. We are in the process of birthing this being into history. It's like, as a species, we are a woman going into labor. We're beginning to get into the real thick of it, where things really begin to fall apart. Imagine if we didn't know we were pregnant. Imagine if we didn't know what we were doing, if we were giving birth. We are in the process of giving birth. I don't think you can't stay in labor too long. It's dangerous for the mother and child. Likewise, the planet is not going to be able to stay in labor too long. It's going to drive us to precipitous and rapid choices, critical choices. If we make those choices well, if we do a good job with this process, I think it will usher a completely different era in human history.
That's beautifully said, and in spite of the terrifying possibilities, incredibly positive, because it shows us that there is, something, that's available to the species and to all human beings. So from there, that almost seems like hard to come back to, somewhat more prosaic or specifics. However, you've made reference to reincarnation and versions thereof a little in this conversation. And I know you made a study of it. You wrote a book about it, and you've had some very interesting thoughts about it. I'm curious. I'm curious about a couple of things here. One of them kind of hits a little trigger point in me, and but sort of a 2 or 3 part question here. One is I think it would be really instructive for people to hear you talk a little about your understanding of incarnation, because you also talk about beyond incarnation and stuff. Yeah. But within that, I have something kind of specific that I've sort of wondered about, and I'm going to read you a quote from your book.
Okay.
If our experience in this life is convoluted and torn by conflicting forces, it was transparently obvious in other words, it was shown to you, that this is caused by the carryover of exercises from other space-time encounters. ... What we are is the result of everything we have ever thought. So the thing that I'm wondering that you could clarify a little on that one is, I think a lot of people would hear that as somehow they're guilty or at fault or to blame for everything that they're experiencing now. And what I wonder about, I understand the principle of what you're saying, but if you're right now living in, I don't know, say Bangladesh, and there's just been another one of those floods or something like that, you're a good-hearted person, you're trying to make a good life for your family. Do you have some culpability or responsibility for being in that situation in the external as well?
Yeah.
You do?
No. I mean, I'm identifying with the power of your question.
Okay, yeah.
I want to step back just for a moment. I feel guilty. We're jumping into really, really heavy topics. We're jumping into, psychedelics and deep states of consciousness and the future of humanity, and really, and we're about to jump into reincarnation. These are all very substantive and deserving issues that need to be taken time. They need to be unfolded carefully and gradually. When I taught a course in my university called Transpersonal Studies, I spent a third of the semester, 5 weeks, just looking at the evidence for rebirth. Okay? It takes time to really unpack all the components and all the nuances. And I think likewise for reincarnation, to bring it here, reincarnation is one of the oldest philosophies on the planet, and it has kept company with many primitive beliefs, which I don't think are really deserving. There are different theories of reincarnation, different sophistications around our understanding of reincarnation. But the key is simply this. We are a learning system. We learn by challenging ourselves. We enter conditions, we make choices, we inherit the consequences of those choices, we internalize those, and eventually we die, and this learning continues. The soul gathers its knowledge, the species gathers its knowledge generation by generation. We plunge back into the process. We keep this process going. We keep trying. We keep exploring. We keep pushing ourselves. And as we go through this process, we activate potentials that are latent within us. Classically, in the Hindu system, we activate the chakras. We move through from the first all the way up to the seventh chakra of oneness. When we incarnate, classically, our story of reincarnation has been a story that's focused on individual karma, the evolution of the individual. I think we've overly personalized karma. We've overly personalized reincarnation. It's not that that's not a true story. That is a true story. The soul is making choices. The soul is growing. But there's another dynamic that's taking place, and that is there's a collective dynamic of reincarnation. There's an evolutionary dynamic of reincarnation. And what the individual can accomplish is always tempered by or influenced what the species is able to accomplish, what is going on in the species. There's one of the hardest things for all of us in any philosophical system or any religious or spiritual system to address or to understand is suffering, just seemingly gratuitous, painful suffering of natural causes and diseases and the terrible things we do to each other. I don't think there's a simple formula for understanding any of these things. They're different perspectives that give us different perspectives on how things, on what levels we want to address this question at. I think we choose, generally, the evidence from a number of sources suggests that we choose where we incarnate. We choose who we incarnate with. We choose incarnating in conditions that can be debilitatingly painful. And if there is an intelligence to the system, if there is a fundamental intelligence to the reincarnational process, there is an intelligence expressing itself even in circumstances of such profound suffering that we can't make sense of it. We can't understand why anyone would choose to submit themselves to that kind of ordeal. And yet, if we can find meaning in certain context, if we can take people into deep states of consciousness and uncover their individual history and find meaningful connection between their former lives, then I think we have grounds for thinking that there is meaning taking place even in those circumstances where we can't necessarily understand it. Mm-hmm. When we're trying to understand individual suffering, there's a set of issues and dynamics that we look at. But if we're trying to understand collective suffering, if we're trying to understand the suffering that touches hundreds of thousands, millions of people's lives all at the same time, generational suffering, we have to bring in a larger picture, a larger apparatus. To me, reincarnation is the higher octave of evolution. In evolution, the creative intelligence of the universe is folding collective learning forward through the evolving of the whole species. Through reincarnation, the creative intelligence of the universe is folding individual learning forward. But individual learning and collective learning are all intertwined because the individual is a human being, and the human being is a species at a certain stage of its evolution. So as the individual grows, the species is growing. I think our entire species is going to a point, or this is what's hard, because it is such a long discussion. There are so many stages. I feel really guilty trying to take the shortcuts that I'm trying to get to extract an answer in a matter of 5 minutes.
I understand.
When it's a long process.
Well, people are going to have to dive into your work more, and one of those ways, of course, is going to be to come to the conference and the post-conference talk you're going to give called "The Birth of the Future Human." So maybe I could
By the
throw
way,
in.
I'll mention this is going to be the first time I've given a public lecture completely dedicated to that topic, the birth of the future human. I've written about it. I wrote about it in Dark Night, Early Dawn. I write about it in Diamonds from Heaven, but I've not really tried to publicly speak about this a lot. So I'm really working hard to prepare that presentation.
Wonderful.
Well, one thing I'd like to say, Chris, is I think it's great material just based on your experience that a lot of people haven't experienced, and the questions really come around. And I really respect, what you want to bring to your answers, because I understand that they're not, quick and something that can just be answered in a sentence or two. What I do really appreciate is, the curiosity and the inspiration and the questions that even come through my mind just listening, because I'm in awe on what you're talking about. And as Stephen says, a million questions. So, I've got a million too, and I'm sure a lot of them are the same.
Yeah.
But it's, what I love about this conversation is that it gets people curious to ask more questions, to look deeper into their own consciousness, and how they choose to then expand that as well.
Yeah.
Because your experience is just one of many different ways people can use plant medicines and different attributes to enhance and expand their consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that the work you've done, you certainly went on a hero's journey like 73 times. I just admire that work, because like we said before we just got on, very, very brave and courageous for the work that you did to find the answers and the insights that you did. So I thank you for that. And I also want to thank you just for wanting to give the answers to the questions, that level of intellectual meat and potatoes, I guess, with the answer,
That almost sounds like an ending. Let's not stop there.
No. I just wanted to clarify, because I could see, just like,
basically,
wow, we could be here for hours, right?
What I've learned is, in studying all the literature that I studied in order to write Life Cycles, the book on reincarnation, and out of the sessions is the circumstances in which we find ourselves have significance. They have meaning. They're not accidental. They're not random. They have meaning. Some of that meaning is individual. Some of that meaning is collective. But how we respond to the circumstances in which we find ourselves, how we allow it to change us, how we make ourselves better human beings in responding to those circumstances, how we learn, that's the vital thing. We may not understand why things are the way they are, but as we respond completely in heart and mind to our circumstances, we change. As we change, we grow. When we look at our lives through multiple iterations and even generations, we're growing, we're changing. The species is growing and changing. The planet is growing and changing. And we're all hardwired into each other in this process.
Amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So I got a few more questions I'd like to fire at you.
Sure.
Some more of these are like, oh God, how do I get all my curiosity into one or two simple kind of things? And this one has to do with
Stephen.
Yeah.
No, it's impossible. So this one has more to do with what you might call, or has been called, non-embodied intelligences. You've talked about the universe in the general sense. I don't recall you ever saying that you'd encountered anything in particular that presented itself in some sort of visual form as an entity or a being or anything like that. But certainly lots of people working with the medicines these days talk about that with ayahuasca and so on. And so that's part of the question, what you would say about that. And another component of that sort of same area of curiosity for me is I was involved in the Native American church peyote ceremonies for about a dozen years. Those people very passionately not only believe but claim that there's a power in prayer, in especially a group intention, all being focused together. But they claim that that when you put out a prayer that sincere, comes from the heart, and perhaps amplified by a medicine like that, that you are indeed that prayer is indeed capable of change in the material realm. So I'm wondering, if you've thought much about that, and then just this general sense of, how intelligence, can manifest or present itself, outside of our human, even to the point of like, is the earth a being? Is the earth an intelligent being? Anyway, whatever you can do with that, please do. Yeah.
Well, I'd say yes and yes. I mean, basically, I think
okay, thanks. Nice chatting with you.
Jeez, those were some easy answers.
Prayers, I think intention is powerful. A collective intention is powerful. Focused intention, amplified intention is powerful. It influences our body. It influences circumstances around us. It influences other people. So I'm really comfortable with that. I think David Nichols has written a book called Subtle Activism, where he's talking about these, he's one of the people who organizes global meditations focused. So we're gathering hundreds of thousands of people in meditational exercises, basically integrating their consciousness into prayerful exercise. Guru yoga in the Buddhist and other traditions, where they are focusing all the disciples from all over the world, all the students of a particular teacher doing a particular practice on a particular day at a particular time. I think these are very, very powerful and focused exercises. My sense is that the spiritual universe is a highly populated world. I mean, it's just, we tend to like to see, imagine if for every physical life form, there were spiritual life forms. For every level of physical life form, there were levels of spiritual life forms. Certainly the sacred medicine tradition is, when we take these various herbs and substances and peyote and mushrooms, that we encounter these living life forms at different levels. We encounter them and we find, much to our surprise, they're interested in us and they're willing to help us and they're willing to work with us. I'm really comfortable with that. I've experienced enough ayahuasca and enough psilocybin mushroom sessions and have encountered, some of the living entities of the universe. In my LSD work, this is a particular medicine that has particular characteristics. So I want to be careful that that's my primary medicine work. I've done other work, but my primary philosophical work has been the LSD work. And LSD tends to be, first of all, it doesn't have many historical fields associated with it. Peyote has been being used for thousands of years. Ayahuasca has been used for thousands of years. So there are fields associated with these medicines. LSD is a new medicine. It doesn't have a lot of fields associated with it. It also tends to be a high altitude medicine. So it tends to blow into the cosmological ceiling. It's not like mushrooms or ayahuasca, which tends to work at a certain level of spiritual reality. It tends to push into kind of the cosmological level. So it also tends to just grind the ego up fine as dust. And my sense is that it's kind of like you have to be a being to encounter beings. And if you're not a being, you don't tend to encounter as many beings. It's not that those beings aren't there, but you kind of, our presence evokes the conversation, or it evokes the experiences that we have from the infinite potential of consciousness. In my experience in working with LSD, when I die at lower levels, I don't simply become a conscious Chris Bache having interesting transpersonal experiences. I cease to be Chris Bache, except with continuity of memory. I have continuity of memory with Chris, but I become different kinds of being. And in my case, I enter different strata of consciousness. So it's kind of like if you were looking at atmosphere, you enter different layers of the atmosphere of a planet. I just dissolve into patterns of consciousness which are not individual, but they tend to be very large and very wide. Not all different medicines tune us to the infinite potential of consciousness in different ways. Peyote tunes us in a certain way. Mushrooms tune us in a certain way. We have it's not like it's all covering the same highway. We have different roads into the landscape and different experiences. But I'm convinced that the entire spiritual landscape is hyper-consciousness, hyper-aware, and is populated with beings.
You know, that what you were talking about with, you know, LSD having its particular characteristic of kind of blasting you out into the cosmos, so to speak, high altitude and all that. In your talk at that transpersonal conference, this is something that I've been quite curious about, and I'll try to explain and turn it into a question, is that you said that it was at some point became very difficult to come back after the end of this 20-year journey, that you really missed that. And that at a certain point you were quite confessional about it, said you actually felt like you were waiting to die, that, you know, there's kind of a, I don't know, maybe a flatness or something about existence here. So where I'm going with this as a question is, you know, I guess I'd have to confess at a much more kindergarten level of experience in these realms, my assumption, or, you know, I guess predilection, has been quite influenced by a Buddhist teacher that I worked with for quite a long time. You might have heard of Chogyam Trungpa.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, a lot of Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings were focused on, you know, this precious human birth and how we, in a sense, revel in it. You know, that, you know, he would use things like learning how to appreciate the redness of red and the blueness of blue, you know. And he said that enlightenment, or I don't know if I'm not quoting him word by word here, but something to the effect of, you know, wisdom or enlightenment is as much about learning how to make a proper cup of tea as anything else, you know. That, you know, we're given this an amazing gift of this particular, you know, constellation of, you know, energies or whatever, densities and all that, with this amazing ability to appreciate this, you know, through our senses and our, you know, our music and, you know, our everything, right? So I'm wondering, you know, why that seemed so flat to you when you came back from this process.
Yeah. Good question. Well formulated. You know, I got into this work for a number of reasons, but certainly, you know, I was interested in enlightenment. I'd been meditating for a number of years. I had encountered the kind of blocks that usually show up in the first years of practice. And I thought that if I did some LSD sessions, I could break through these blocks and expose my own foibles, and I would wake up sooner. I would kind of accelerate my own enlightenment. What I found was that working in the particular modality that I did, very high doses, it took me so far that I began to realize that a lot of my experiences that were happening, first of all, were not concerning me personally, but they were larger than me. And there was something deeper going on than enlightenment. Enlightenment is a perfectly acceptable and wonderful focus for one's life. But what was happening in my sessions was something different. At the end, it curved back around toward the Enlightenment tradition, but it was something different. It was a process of exploring the cosmos. So there is the Enlightenment project or spiritual development, and then simply exploring the cosmos, going deeper and deeper into the cosmos itself. What happened for me is that in the last 5 years of this work, when I went into the Diamond Luminosity work, I dissolved so deeply into that light, into the body of God, you might say, in the Dharmakaya. After doing that particular phase of the work for 5 years, I came to a point where I knew I had to stop. And I had to stop for a couple of reasons. One is because my system was running so hot. It was just running so hot, it was always uncomfortable. I was having some subtle energy issues. I was overheating my system, essentially. But the main reason I stopped was that I could not bear the heartache of coming back. So I had dissolved so intimately into the divine that when I came back, there was such a sense of withdrawal and such a sense of loss that I just couldn't keep going out into it and coming back. Now, ideally, of course, one wants to open up to that kind of intimacy in a way that you don't have to come back from. You want to open up into oneness with the divine, or experiencing the divine luminosity in a way that you can sustain in your physical consciousness. That is the spiritual ideal in a way. Working with psychedelics, particularly the way that I worked with them, this is a path of temporary immersion. It temporarily opens you to the universe, and then you come back, and temporarily opens, you come back. And I drove myself so deep into the universe that eventually when I stopped my work, I thought I was just going to be able to stop and process and enjoy the many gifts that I had been given. But after I stopped, I found myself entering a deep and profound sadness. And that's why it's not just a hero's journey. It is, I understand that. But it's also the story of the wounded hero. It's someone who was wounded deeply by the sheer beauty of what she discovered. So I found it, when I did come back, when I began to stop my sessions, I found that I was missing the communion with the divine so deeply that I really was just waiting to die. I was waiting to wrap up my life. I was taking care of my children, my family, and I was teaching and doing things, but this life had become flat. And I knew that the physical world was the body of the divine. I knew that it was the manifestation of the creative intelligence of the universe. It was the divine in manifest form. I knew that the limitations were all mine. What I had done in all this, the way I did the work, I lost the balance. There's a balance between transcendence and immanence. There's the transcendent divine and the immanent divine. I had pushed myself so deeply in the path of transcendence that I had lost my foothold in the immanent divine. So it's a balancing act between opening up to the totality of all that is in all of its dimensions and all of its levels, and then grounding in the present body, in the present day, in the present life, in your present form. I got those out of balance, and it took years of work to sort of commit myself to regrounding myself in the here and now as I am for the remainder of my life. And that's why, among other reasons, that's one of the reasons I wouldn't encourage people to do what I did. It's a tricky thing. A little bit of transcendence is a very good thing. It can heal us. It can show us who we are. It can help us understand what's going on in life. It can activate very positive dimensions of our being. But if you plunge yourself too deeply into transcendence, you can lose your footing in the here and now. Mm-hmm. And the blessings of the here and now are equally important blessings to the blessings of transcendence. This physical world is a sacred, special place. And I think enlightenment is an attempt to awaken to become transparent to the totality, but in a way that keeps your feet solidly planted on the earth.
Do you think you would have been able to come back with the same kind of incontrovertible understandings and insights had you not, done it that intensively? You don't know.
The path not taken.
Yeah. Marc?
So my question then is, one thing we see a real need for within our community is the need for the integration after doing this kind of work.
Yeah.
And then, which leads me to the question is, how did you then adjust or transform yourself so that you weren't just kind of waiting to die? How did you get that joy for this life back?
Yeah. I think integration is one of the very powerful emerging themes in the psychedelic community, and it's really, really important. It's been undervalued and understated. I mean, as long as we're staying close to conventional reality and we're healing the personal psyche, I think we have medical models for what healthy integration looks like. And if we go deeper to experience the intelligence that runs through all things and the continuity of life after death, we still have spiritual models that help us understand and integrate those experiences into a well-lived life. But when you go farther than that, when you go deeper than that, when you go beyond physical space-time reality, when you plunge deep into the universe, then I think integration becomes a more fundamental question. And frankly, I've spent a year writing just the last chapter of Diamonds from Heaven, which is the chapter of coming off the mountain. It's a chapter on integration. In order to kind of reground myself, I grabbed my life and I recommitted myself to being on this earth. I renewed my contemplative practice. I deepened my contemplative practice. I renewed my commitment to the body. I renewed my commitment to relationships. But the other thing I found was the sadness of leaving the communion with the divine was exacerbated by the silence that my society forced upon me because of its prohibitions around psychedelics. I wasn't allowed to talk about my experiences. I'm a teacher. I want to discover and I want to share. I wasn't allowed to share my experiences. I had to keep quiet. I wasn't allowed to talk to my students. I wasn't allowed to talk to my colleagues about this work. I did this work as a philosopher, but I was not being allowed to function as a philosopher. And what I found was that there's a section in the chapter I call the sickness of silence. Integration is not simply a psychological process, it's a social process. And socially, I was not allowed to integrate my experiences into my life. I had split myself in half. And it was really writing Diamonds from Heaven, first writing Dark Night, Early Dawn, and then writing Diamonds from Heaven, where I began to put together the two halves of my life. I began to put together my psychedelic half and my professorial, physical half. And it really began to speaking clearly and powerfully about my experiences and writing about them, that I've begun to feel myself more grounded on the earth in a way that I had not felt in years prior. So part of it is integration means bringing the experiences back and being willing to share them and talk about them and engage people around them.
Excellent.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So
because we see that a lot
go ahead.
ourselves. And one other question was then, slipped my mind, Stephen. Go ahead.
That's great.
Well, I think, people have taken in so much, if they're watching this, that at this point they're probably going to go have to pour themselves a whiskey anyway. Just to calm down a little, they're not in Kansas anymore now. So perhaps just to kind of end on an uplifting note, so to speak. You talked about how we can do it, we will do it in a sense, and that we have choices. But let's assume that that the process works out in the best way that can, the journey for the species over the next, whatever it is, several decades or so, and we are able to, go through that consciousness revolution and so on. Yeah. Maybe just you could sum up with a little bit about what does the future human look like?
First, we've been building the future human for tens of thousands of years. We've been building it with every incarnation, every repetitive cycle. We've been building it. We've been activating the form that this human being is. We've been learning it, stretching it, teaching it, growing it, lifetime by lifetime, lifetime by lifetime. I think where we're going, what's going to be happening is all of our former lives are coming together as we become more coherent, as we become more integrated. All of these lives come together. The way I experienced it in the session was I experienced one session where all my former lives began to come together like wrapping string around a kite spool. And at a certain point, they fused. There was an explosion of energy, and they fused. And when they fused, this diamond light broke out of my chest and threw me into a completely different state of consciousness. It was individual, but it was a form of individual consciousness that was beyond anything that I had ever experienced before. And it wasn't simply the sum of the individual lives, that all of those lives had been actualized in a higher form of evolutionary expression. I think the future human, what I touched there was my own personal version of the future human that is evolving in evolution. We have to picture a species where we have healed all the pains of history, where we've healed all the divisions against each other and against our own body and against our own soul, where we have opened our heart to all, not only all human beings, but all life forms, where our mind is in conscious communion, more conscious and open communion with the intelligence of the universe. In one of the very last sessions, it was one of the most difficult sessions I ever went through. I went through a huge trip down, was taken far into the future, deeper into deep time than I'd ever been. And one of the gems of that session was to actually experience the archetypal form of the future human, what we are in the process of becoming. And truly, I mean, it's like you hear it said, we're becoming a planet of Buddhas, a planet of Christ, a planet of prophets. We're becoming picture the highest levels of spiritual realization that we have known in history, individuals have accomplished, and picture the entire species operating at that level. What kind of species would we be when the entire species is enlightened, when the entire species is uplifted spiritually and emotionally and psychologically? That's what we're in the process of becoming. Once we have activated that deep level of our own being collectively, then we can really begin to cook. Then we can really begin to do something exciting on the planet, off the planet, into the galaxy. I mean, the intelligence that created this universe thinks on a scale that just still boggles our mind. And I think our planet is one of many hothouses where consciousness is being incubated. But it's not going to stay on this planet. It's going to migrate. It's going to move. It's going to go forward. But in order to make this jump, we first have to grow up. We first have to come to terms with what we are. We have to stop thinking in terms of this body, this life, and open ourselves to the full depth and splendor of the being that lies within. And we
Beautiful.
are. I think we are.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. I love it.
Does that sound like a good place to end, Marc?
It couldn't have been a better segue in this whole conversation to, tail off such a deep and inspiring and thought-provoking conversation for sure. So I thank you very much for that, Chris. I look forward to meeting you in person. I look forward to hearing your talk at the conference. And
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it very much. I'm looking forward to that weekend. It's going to be marvelous. I can't believe the wonderful people that you've gathered for that weekend. I'm really looking forward to it.
It's growing and it's just getting more and more popular every day. We're really excited to what's going to transform here for this year's conference. And, it's just exciting to be part of it.
Yeah.
And, Chris, I'd love to reach out the invitation at some point too, is, if you're interested in doing more of these kind of conversations to share some of your insights with people. I'm sure Stephen and I would be happy to facilitate and do some things of that nature as well. Because I think there's, we've barely even scratched the surface. There's so much to talk about here with you that, I've got tons of questions myself, but I'm also kind of left here just a little shell shocked.
Well, when we gather in Vancouver, then maybe we can sit down and have some conversations about where we might take the future conversation.
Excellent.
Sounds good. to me.
Do you have any projected publication date for Diamonds from Heaven, the forthcoming book?
It'll be out in the second half of 2019. That's all I've been able to get from the publisher. So it's in the process. So hopefully within a year from now, it'll be out.
All right.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. And
Any final words,
no, just
Stephen?
oh no, just thank you. It's it's amazing. I'm really amazed at the work you've done, and really grateful actually. I mean, it was very difficult for you to go through that process, as you've made clear, and you've kind of done the work that not a lot of people are going to do at that level. So you've brought back gems to share, and it's wonderful.
Thank you. It's been an honor. It's a privilege. And I'm really looking forward to meeting both of you in person.
Likewise.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Us too. Well, until we see you in November 2nd,
Okay.
live your life. Awesome.
Yep.
Thanks.
Blessings.
Awesome.
Good day.
All right.
Thank-
Bye-bye.
Thanks again, gentlemen. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye now.
I'm stopping my camera.